February 9th, 1964. A Sunday night. Across America, families gather around television sets in living rooms from coast to coast. It's 8 o'clock Eastern Time, and Ed Sullivan is about to introduce 4 young men from Liverpool, England. What happens in the next 12 minutes will change the course of American culture forever. If you were watching that night, you remember exactly where you were. Maybe you were a teenager, arguing with your parents about whether you could stay up to watch. Maybe you were younger, sneaking peeks from the hallway. Or perhaps you were already grown, curious about what all the fuss was about with these British kids everyone was talking about. 73 million Americans tuned in that night. To put that in perspective, that's more than 40% of the entire country. More people than had watched anything in television history up to that point. The nation held its collective breath. But here's what most people don't know. The Beatles themselves were terrified. Backstage at the CBS Theater in New York City, John Lennon paced nervously, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his guitar strap. Paul McCartney kept clearing his throat, testing his voice over and over. George Harrison, only 20 years old, looked pale under the harsh backstage lights. And Ringo Starr sat at his drums, methodically tapping out rhythms on his knee, trying to calm himself. They had conquered England. They had topped the British charts. But America? America was different. America was where dreams came to die for British acts. No British rock and roll artist had ever truly made it in the States. The Beatles knew they had one shot, one performance, to either win over America or go home as just another footnote. George had whispered to John earlier that day. John's response was pure bravado, but his eyes betrayed his own nerves. Then we'll just be the biggest thing in Liverpool, won't we? The screaming started before they even walked on stage, a sound unlike anything American television had ever broadcast. Young girls in the audience were already crying, their hands pressed to their faces, overcome with emotion before a single note had been played. Ed Sullivan stepped forward, that familiar slight smile on his face, and raised his hand for quiet. The screaming barely diminished. "Yesterday and today," he began, his voice fighting against the noise. "Our theater's been jammed with newspapermen and hundreds of photographers from all over the nation. These veterans agreed with me that this city has never witnessed the excitement stirred by these youngsters from Liverpool." The camera cut to the audience. Young faces, rapt with anticipation. Parents looking bemused, curious, skeptical. And then Sullivan said the words that would echo through history. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles!" What happened next wasn't just a performance, it was a cultural earthquake. But to understand why that moment mattered so much, we need to go back. Back to where it all began, and understand what America was like before the Beatles arrived. Because on February 9th, 1964, America was a nation waiting for something it didn't even know it needed. To understand what the Beatles meant to America, you have to understand what America had lost. It was November 22nd, 1963. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The nation plunged into mourning. For weeks, Americans walked around in a daze, trying to process the incomprehensible. Television networks showed nothing but funeral coverage and somber retrospectives. The optimism of Camelot had ended in blood and tears. By early 1964, America was still grieving. We were a nation desperate for something joyful, something innocent, something that could make us smile again. We just didn't know what that something would look like. The music scene in America reflected this heaviness. Rock and roll, which had exploded with Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard in the 50s, had lost its way. Elvis was making movies in Hollywood, increasingly distant from the raw energy that made him dangerous. Chuck Berry was dealing with legal troubles. Little Richard had temporarily left music for ministry. Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper had died in that plane crash back in '59, the day the music died, as Don McLean would later sing. What was filling the airwaves? Smooth pop. Bobby Vinton singing Blue Velvet. The Four Seasons with their falsetto harmonies. Safe music. Pleasant music. Music that wouldn't upset anybody's parents. The edge, the rebellion, the excitement that made rock and roll matter had been sanitized away. Radio DJs across the country were hungry for something new. Something with energy. They got dozens of new singles every week, but most sounded the same. Polished, professional, forgettable. Then, in late December 1963, something unusual happened. A DJ in Washington, D.C., named Carol James, received a request from a teenage girl who'd heard about this British group while visiting England. Did he have their record? James didn't, but he was intrigued enough to track down a copy of I Want to Hold Your Hand from British Airways. He played it once. The station's phone lines exploded. Within days, other DJs across the country were scrambling to get copies. A record that Capitol Records had barely planned to release in America was suddenly the most requested song on radio. Capitol rushed to press American copies, releasing it on December 26th. By the time the Beatles landed at newly renamed Kennedy Airport on February 7, 1964, I Want to Hold Your Hand had sold over 1 million copies in America. It would hit #1 on the Billboard charts on February 1st, a week before the Ed Sullivan appearance. But Capitol Records and Ed Sullivan's producers were still nervous. Sure, the record was selling, but British acts didn't translate to American stages. The Beatles might be a flash in the pan, a novelty that would fade as quickly as it appeared. Ed Sullivan himself had seen the Beatles almost by accident. He'd been at London's Heathrow Airport in October '63 and witnessed the madness firsthand. Thousands of screaming teenagers, police barricades, pure pandemonium as the Beatles returned from a trip to Sweden. Sullivan, a man who'd seen countless acts and witnessed the early days of Elvis, was stunned. He'd asked an airport official. "The Beatles are arriving," came the reply, as if that explained everything. Sullivan immediately called his producers in New York. "Book them," he said. "I don't care what it costs. Book them." The deal was struck, $10,000 for 3 appearances. In today's money, that's about $90,000. The Beatles' manager, Brian Epstein, negotiated top billing, an unusual concession for Sullivan, who typically kept variety acts humble. When the Beatles' plane touched down at Kennedy Airport that Friday afternoon, 3,000 screaming teenagers were waiting. The press conference that followed became legendary for the Beatles' wit and charm. A reporter asked. John deadpanned. Another asked. Ringo replied. The American press, used to polite, carefully managed stars, didn't know what to make of these 4 irreverent, funny, sharp young men. They were nothing like the clean-cut American pop stars. They had long hair, for crying out loud. Hair that touched their collars. Parents across America were already horrified. But teenagers? Teenagers saw something different. They saw freedom, humor, energy. They saw 4 guys who looked like they were having the time of their lives. Sunday night was coming. 73 million people would be watching. The Beatles had 2 days to rehearse, to prepare, to get ready for the biggest moment of their young lives. In hotel rooms at the Plaza, John, Paul, George, and Ringo tried to stay calm. But the screaming outside never stopped. Day and night, hundreds of teenage girls surrounded the hotel, hoping for just a glimpse. America was waiting. The Beatles were ready. And on Sunday night, everything would change. 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The Ed Sullivan Show logo fills television screens across America. Families settle into their seats. This is appointment television, a Sunday night ritual in millions of homes. The show opens with Ed Sullivan's usual variety format, a comedy act, a performer on a tightrope. The teenage girls in the studio audience are barely paying attention, fidgeting, waiting. The cameras occasionally cut to them, and you can see it on their faces, that barely contained excitement, that sense that something monumental is about to happen. Then Sullivan makes the announcement. The screaming begins before the curtain even parts. John, Paul, George, and Ringo walk onto the stage at Studio 50, and the sound that erupts is like nothing American television has ever captured. It's not just loud, it's a physical force. The CBS engineers had never heard anything like it through their equipment. The sound meters were hitting levels that shouldn't have been possible from a studio audience of 700 people. The Beatles take their positions. Paul at his Hofner bass, that distinctive violin-shaped instrument. George with his Gretsch guitar. John with his Rickenbacker. And Ringo behind the drums, his bass drumhead reading "The Beatles" in that distinctive drop T logo. They're wearing identical dark suits with narrow lapels, white shirts, thin black ties. Their hair, which seemed so long and scandalous to American eyes, was actually carefully styled, matching bowl cuts that would define a decade. Paul steps to the microphone. The count-off happens so fast you might miss it. And then, quote 15, "All My Loving," bursts forth with an energy that jumps through the television screen. Paul's voice, clear and earnest, cutting through the screaming. John and George's harmonies, tight and practiced. The rhythm, driving and insistent. This isn't the smooth, polished pop that had dominated American radio. This is raw, vital, urgent. The camera work, by today's standards, is simple. Wide shots of the band, close-ups of each member. But there's something revolutionary happening that viewers at home might not consciously notice. The Beatles are a band. They're playing their own instruments. They're singing their own songs. They wrote this music themselves. In 1964, this was radical. American pop stars were handed songs by professional songwriters, backed by studio musicians. They were products, carefully manufactured and controlled. But here were four guys who did everything themselves, who looked like they were genuinely enjoying themselves, who projected an image of collaboration and fun. The screaming never stops throughout All My Loving. You can barely hear the music over it. But it doesn't matter. Something is happening that transcends the audio quality. A connection is being forged between the band and America's youth. The song ends. Applause mixed with screaming. Ed Sullivan appears, trying to speak over the noise. "That was wonderful," he says, but his words are almost lost. They perform "Till There Was You" next, a ballad from the Broadway musical The Music Man. This choice was deliberate, strategic. Brian Epstein wanted to show Americans that the Beatles weren't just rockers, that they had range, that they could appeal to parents, too. Paul sings lead, his voice tender and controlled. The arrangement is gentle, featuring George's classical guitar work prominently. For a moment, the screaming subsides just slightly. Parents watching at home nod approvingly. Maybe these boys aren't so bad after all. But then comes the moment that will be remembered forever. The final song of the first set, "She Loves You." If All My Loving was energetic, "She Loves You" is explosive. That distinctive quote 17 chorus, those head shakes as John and Paul sing into the same microphone, the pure joy radiating from the stage. This is what rock and roll was supposed to be. This is what America had been missing. The camera operators can barely keep up. They're cutting between shots rapidly, trying to capture the energy, the movement, the sheer force of personality emanating from these four young men. Close-ups reveal something the studio audience can't see. The Beatles are nervous, but they're nailing it anyway. Paul's left hand shakes slightly on the bass neck. John's eyes dart to his bandmates for reassurance. But they're executing flawlessly. And then it's over. The first set concludes. The Beatles disappear backstage. Commercial break. In living rooms across America, teenagers are jumping off couches, screaming themselves. Parents are looking at each other, bewildered. What just happened? What was that? Phone lines across the country light up. Friends calling friends. Are you watching this? Can you believe this? Radio stations' request lines jam with calls asking when they'll play more Beatles music. The show continues with other acts. Magician Fred Capps performs. Broadway star Georgia Brown sings. The studio audience, still buzzing with energy, barely notices. Then, at approximately 8:45 p.m., Ed Sullivan introduces the Beatles again. Two more songs. I Saw Her Standing There and I Want to Hold Your Hand. I Saw Her Standing There opens with Paul's count-off, quote, 20, and that opening bass line that would become iconic. The energy, impossibly, is even higher than the first set. The Beatles have gained confidence. They're working the camera now, Paul winking, John smirking at something between verses, George focused intensely on his guitar work. The performance of I Want to Hold Your Hand is pure electricity. This is the song that brought them here, the #1 record in America, and they deliver it with everything they have. The harmonies are perfect, the energy is off the charts. Ringo's drumming drives the whole thing forward with that distinctive Beatles beat. As the final chord rings out, as Ed Sullivan returns to thank them and close the show, something profound has happened. America has been irrevocably changed. The British invasion has begun. The 1960s, as we think of them culturally, have truly started. 73 million people just witnessed history. Most of them don't fully realize it yet. But they will. Oh, they will. Monday morning, February 10th, 1964. America wakes up different. The newspapers that hit doorsteps across the country lead with Beatles headlines. The New York Times, that bastion of serious journalism, gives them prominent coverage. The Herald Tribune runs a photo above the fold showing the band mid-performance, mouths open in harmony, surrounded by screaming girls. But it's the numbers that tell the real story. The Ed Sullivan Show had delivered the largest audience in television history. 73 million viewers. During the hour the Beatles performed, crime rates in American cities dropped measurably. Teenagers who might have been out causing trouble were home watching television. Police precincts across the country reported their quietest Sunday night in years. At the Plaza Hotel, the Beatles couldn't leave. The crowd outside had swelled to thousands. Police barricades kept the fans at bay, but barely. Every time one of the Beatles appeared at a window, the screaming intensified to levels that worried the hotel management. Radio stations experienced something unprecedented. Requests for Beatles songs outnumbered all other requests combined by factors of 10 to 1, 20 to 1. DJs who'd been skeptical were now scrambling to play I Want to Hold Your Hand on repeat. Program directors who'd dismissed Beatlemania as a British fad were calling Capitol Records, begging for more product. Capitol had been caught completely unprepared. They'd pressed what they thought was an adequate supply of singles and albums. By Monday morning, record stores across America were sold out. Capitol's pressing plants went into 24-hour operation trying to meet demand. Distributors reported they could sell every copy they received within hours of arrival. In high schools across America, the hallways buzzed with Beatles talk. Girls who'd watched the show recounted every moment in detail to friends who'd missed it. Boys debated which Beatle was the best musician. Teachers tried to start classes, but found students distracted, drawing Beatles logos on notebook covers, humming "She Loves You" under their breath. The backlash started almost immediately, too. Newspaper columnists, particularly older ones, wrote scathing dismissals. "Four effeminate British kids with mop-top haircuts," one critic wrote. "Talentless noise merchants riding a wave of teenage hysteria," claimed another. "This too shall pass," predicted a third, with misplaced confidence. Religious leaders worried about the moral implications. Rock and roll had always been suspect in certain quarters, but there was something about the intensity of teenage girls' reactions to the Beatles that made parents and preachers nervous. Letters to the editor expressed concern about, quote, 24, quote, and, quote, 25, quote. But the teenagers didn't care what the adults thought. That was part of the point. Cultural critics who were paying closer attention noticed something else happening. The Beatles represented a shift in the relationship between America and Britain. For the first time since the Revolutionary War, British culture was influencing American youth culture in a significant way. The British invasion, as it would come to be called, was just beginning. Behind the scenes, the music industry was in chaos. Record executives scrambled to sign British acts. Any band with long hair and British accents could suddenly get a meeting. Liverpool became a pilgrimage site for American record scouts. The search was on for the next Beatles, even though the Beatles themselves were just getting started. Other British bands that had been struggling to get American distribution suddenly found doors opening. The Rolling Stones, the Dave Clark Five, the Animals, the Kinks, all would benefit from the path the Beatles had blazed. But in those first few days after the Sullivan Show, it was all Beatles, all the time. The second and third Sullivan appearances were still to come, scheduled for February 16th and 23rd. The anticipation was building. On February 11th, the Beatles took their first American concert stage at the Washington Coliseum. 20,000 people attended. The stage was set up in the round, and at intervals, Ringo's drum kit had to be physically rotated so different sections of the audience could see the band. The screaming was so loud that the Beatles couldn't hear themselves play. John Lennon later said it was like playing in a hurricane. The next night, Carnegie Hall. 2 shows. Both sold out in minutes. Carnegie Hall, that temple of classical music and high culture, hosting a rock and roll band. The symbolism wasn't lost on observers. High culture and popular culture were colliding. The Beatles' press conferences continued to charm and bewilder American journalists. "What do you think about the criticism that you can't sing?" a reporter asked at one. "We agree with you," John shot back immediately, getting a laugh from the room. "What's your message to American teenagers?" another inquired. Paul's response, quote 30, "They were irreverent in a way that American stars weren't allowed to be. They punctured pomposity. They refused to take themselves too seriously. And American teenagers loved them for it." By the time the Beatles left New York for their Miami Beach Ed Sullivan appearance, they'd been in America for 9 days. 9 days that changed everything. The music industry would never be the same. American culture would never be the same. And rock and roll, which had been sliding toward irrelevance, was reborn with new energy, new possibilities, new life. But we're still only at the beginning of understanding what it all meant. The full impact of February 9th, 1964 would take years to fully reveal itself. The seeds planted that night would grow into the countercultural revolution of the late 60s, the evolution of rock into an art form, the transformation of popular music itself. For now, though, America was simply Beatlemanic, and there was no cure in sight. To fully grasp what the Beatles meant to America in 1964, We need to understand the world teenage Americans were living in that winter. The generation watching the Ed Sullivan Show that night was the vanguard of the baby boom. Born in the late 40s, they were coming of age in a country that was, on the surface, prosperous and confident. America had won World War II. The economy was booming. Suburban developments were spreading across the landscape. Families were buying cars, televisions, washing machines. The American dream seemed within reach for the middle class. But underneath that prosperity, tensions were building. The civil rights movement was gathering momentum. In August '63, Martin Luther King Jr. had delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington. In September, 4 young girls had been killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The fight for equality was forcing America to confront its deepest contradictions. The Cold War cast a long shadow. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October '62 had brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Schools still conducted duck and cover drills, teaching children to hide under desks as if that would protect them from atomic bombs. The threat of annihilation was a background hum to daily life. Vietnam was on the horizon, though most Americans weren't paying attention yet. American military advisors were in Southeast Asia, but full-scale war was still a year away. The draft hadn't yet become the omnipresent threat it would become for young men. Socially, America in early '64 was still buttoned up, still conformist. Men wore hats and suits. Women wore dresses and gloves. Hair was short and neat. Behavior was controlled and proper. The '50s conformity that social critics had worried about was still firmly in place. For teenagers, this meant restriction. You did what your parents told you. You dressed the way you were supposed to. You listened to music your parents approved of. You followed the rules. Rock and roll had briefly offered an escape in the '50s. Elvis had been dangerous, threatening, sexual. But Elvis had been tamed. The Army had cut his hair. Colonel Parker had put him in movies. By '64, Elvis was singing to beach bunnies in lightweight comedies. The music that dominated American radio in late '63 reflected this sanitization. It was pleasant, professional, safe. The Singing Nun with Dominique. Bobby Vinton's There I've Said It Again. Lovely songs, certainly, but hardly revolutionary. American teenagers were ready for something more without quite knowing what they wanted. They felt the disconnect between the perfect suburban image sold to them and the messy reality of the world. They saw the violence of the civil rights struggle on television news. They felt the anxiety of the nuclear age. They were coming of age in a time of transition, standing between the old certainties of their parents' generation and something new that hadn't yet been defined. The generation gap was real and widening. Parents who'd lived through the Depression and World War II couldn't understand why their comfortable, prosperous children seemed restless and dissatisfied. What more did they want? Into this moment came 4 young men from Liverpool, with long hair, sharp suits, and songs about holding hands and loving each other. On the surface, the Beatles' message seemed simple, even innocent. But there was something subversive in their very existence. They were self-contained. They didn't need adult authority figures telling them what to do. They wrote their own songs, played their own instruments, made their own decisions. They were irreverent toward authority, quick-witted, confident. They represented autonomy at a time when teenagers were expected to defer to their elders in all things. Their hair, which seems quaint now, was genuinely radical in 1964. Hair touching the collar was considered long, feminine, improper. Barbershops across America displayed signs, "We don't cut Beatle haircuts." Principals sent boys home from school for having hair too long. The Beatles' hair was a challenge to conformity, a visible marker of difference. The sexual hysteria they provoked in teenage girls was deeply unsettling to adult observers. Girls screaming, crying, fainting. This wasn't the controlled, chaperoned dating ritual parents approved of. This was raw emotion, unleashed passion. Girls expressing desire openly and loudly. Cultural historians would later recognize that the British invasion, and the Beatles in particular, gave American teenagers permission to be different, to challenge authority, to trust their own taste over their parents' approval. The seeds of the counterculture revolution were being planted in those screaming audiences, in those kids who watched Ed Sullivan and decided they wanted to grow their hair, start a band, write their own songs. The Beatles arrived at exactly the right moment. America needed joy after the Kennedy assassination. American teenagers needed something that was theirs, something adults didn't understand or approve of. American music needed revitalization after years of playing it safe. The British were coming with guitars and drums instead of muskets and cannons, and they would conquer American culture more thoroughly than King George ever dreamed possible. February 9th, '64 was the beginning. The starting gun for a cultural revolution that would transform America's music, fashion, values, and social structures. All from 12 minutes on a variety show. The Beatles returned to the Ed Sullivan stage on February 16th, broadcasting from the Deauville Hotel in Miami Beach. If anything, the screaming was louder, the excitement more intense. They performed 6 songs across 2 sets, and the ratings were astronomical again. But something had shifted. This wasn't novelty anymore. This was a phenomenon, a movement, something that showed no signs of slowing down. Record stores couldn't keep up with demand. Capitol Records reported that Beatles records were selling at a rate of 10,000 copies per hour in New York City alone. Meet the Beatles, their first American album, shipped 3 million copies in its first 3 weeks. It would spend 11 weeks at #1 on the Billboard album chart. The charts themselves were being reshaped. By April '64, the Beatles would hold the top 5 positions on the Billboard Hot 100 simultaneously, a feat never accomplished before or since. Can't Buy Me Love, Twist and Shout, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Please Please Me, all in the top 5 at the same time. Other British acts were rushing to capitalize on the opening the Beatles had created. The Dave Clark Five's Glad All Over hit the American charts. Peter and Gordon scored with World Without Love, a song written by Paul McCartney. The Animals were preparing their breakthrough hit, House of the Rising Sun. American bands scrambled to adapt. Garage bands sprouted in every suburb and small town across the country. Kids who'd been taking piano lessons suddenly wanted guitars. Music stores sold out of electric guitars and amplifiers. Ludwig couldn't manufacture drum sets fast enough to meet demand. Every band wanted to be the American Beatles. The Beau Brummels in San Francisco adopted British-style suits and haircuts. The Byrds in Los Angeles merged Beatles-style harmonies with American folk music. Paul Revere and the Raiders wore Revolutionary War costumes but played British invasion-style rock. The folk music scene, which had been the alternative to pop music, felt the Beatles' impact too. Bob Dylan, who'd been strictly acoustic, would go electric in '65, partly inspired by the Beatles' demonstration that rock and roll could be sophisticated and meaningful. In New York City's Greenwich Village, a young musician named John Sebastian would form the Lovin' Spoonful, blending American roots music with British invasion energy. On the West Coast, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys heard Rubber Soul and felt challenged to create something equally ambitious, which would become Pet Sounds. The Beatles weren't just popular, they were reshaping the entire landscape of popular music. Fashion changed almost overnight. Stores couldn't stock enough slim-cut suits, the mod look that the Beatles exemplified. Bootmakers sold out of the elastic-sided boots the Beatles wore, which became known as Beatle boots. J.C. Penney introduced a Beatle clothing line. Hair became a battleground. Fathers and sons fought over length. Schools implemented strict grooming codes in reaction to kids showing up with longer hair. Barbers complained they were losing business. Teen magazines published step-by-step guides on how to achieve the Beatle haircut. The conflict over hair seems trivial in retrospect, but it was emblematic of larger generational tensions. Hair was visible, public, a statement of allegiance. Long hair said, "I'm with the Beatles, with the new thing, with my generation." It was a form of rebellion that didn't require actually doing anything dangerous. Girls' fashion changed too. The feminine, British mod look started appearing in American stores. Shorter skirts, bold patterns, a more playful and youthful aesthetic than the structured, proper styles of the 50s. Language evolved. British slang entered American teenagers' vocabulary. Words that sounded exotic and cool. Saying became a code, a way of identifying yourself as part of Beatlemania. The phenomenon crossed all demographic lines. Rich kids and poor kids, city kids and rural kids, all were swept up. The Beatles transcended regional and class boundaries in a way that few cultural phenomena do. Even some adults started coming around. After the initial shock, parents realized the Beatles were actually pretty wholesome. They wore suits. They were polite in interviews. Their songs were about love and romance, not rebellion or danger. Conservative columnist William F. Buckley Jr., hardly a rock and roll fan, wrote that the Beatles had and were. But the deeper transformation was happening beneath the surface. The Beatles were demonstrating that young people could create culture, not just consume what adults produced for them. They showed that you could be successful on your own terms, that talent and creativity could triumph over manufactured images. Thousands of teenage boys across America picked up guitars in '64 with dreams of being the Beatles. Most would never make it professionally. But those garage bands, those kids learning to play together in basements and garages, would become the foundation of the American rock explosion of the late '60s. Some of them were in San Francisco, laying the groundwork for the psychedelic revolution. Some were in Los Angeles, developing the California sound. Some were in Detroit, where Motown was already creating its own revolution. Some were in Seattle, in Chicago, in Memphis, in 1,000 small towns where kids were picking up instruments and forming bands. The Beatles had shown them it was possible. 4 regular guys, not much older than they were, had conquered the world. Maybe they could too. The British invasion of '64 through '66 would bring hundreds of British acts to America. Some were talented and innovative. Some were cynical attempts to cash in on a trend. But all of them owed their opportunity to what happened on February 9th, 1964. That Ed Sullivan appearance was the big bang of '60s rock culture. Everything that followed expanded outward from that moment. Not everyone was swept up in Beatlemania. For every teenager screaming with joy, there was an adult shaking their head in dismay. The backlash was swift and, at times, vicious. Critics dismissed the Beatles as a fad, talentless hacks riding a wave of teenage hysteria that would soon crash. Newsweek magazine called them, quote, 41, quote. One music critic wrote that they couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. Another claimed they represented the death of real musicianship. The criticism often revealed more about the critics than about the Beatles. Jazz musicians and critics, seeing their own music losing cultural relevance, attacked the Beatles as simplistic noise. Classical musicians dismissed rock and roll entirely as beneath serious consideration. The older generation of pop singers, like Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, made jokes about the Beatles' hair and music. Sinatra, who would later develop respect for the Beatles, initially called their music, quote, 42, quote, and worried that it represented, quote, 43, quote. Within a few years, he'd be covering Beatles songs and admitting he'd underestimated them. The attacks got personal. Critics called the Beatles effeminate because of their hair. Columnists questioned their masculinity. Psychologists wrote think pieces about what the Beatles phenomenon said about American teenagers' mental health. Some suggested that Beatlemania was a form of mass psychosis. Religious leaders worried about the quasi-religious fervor of Beatles fans. The screaming, the fainting, the worship. It looked uncomfortably like religious ecstasy directed at 4 young men from Liverpool instead of at God. Some ministers preached sermons warning against making false idols of pop stars. In the American South, some radio stations refused to play Beatles music, seeing it as part of the British cultural invasion. A few stations held Beatles record-breaking parties where kids could bring their Beatles albums to be smashed and burned. The turnout was usually disappointing, but it made for good publicity. Politicians got involved too. Several congressmen made speeches about the negative influence of the Beatles on American youth. One proposed a resolution condemning long hair on men as unpatriotic. The resolution went nowhere, but it captured the anxiety many adults felt. Educators worried that Beatlemania was distracting students from their studies. Some schools banned Beatles lunchboxes, Beatles clothing, anything Beatles related. Teachers confiscated teen magazines with Beatles photos. Principals gave speeches warning students not to let Beatles fever interfere with academics. The criticism and resistance created an interesting dynamic. The more adults attacked the Beatles, the more teenagers defended them. Every adult denunciation made the Beatles cooler, more important, more essential to teenage identity. The Beatles became a generational marker, a line in the sand between the old world and the new. Parents who were horrified by their daughters screaming at the television didn't realize they were cementing the Beatles' importance. By making them forbidden fruit, by treating Beatlemania as dangerous, they made it irresistible. The Beatles handled the criticism with remarkable grace and humor. When a reporter asked what they thought about the criticism that they couldn't sing, John quipped, "We know we can't sing." When asked if they took themselves seriously, Paul responded, "Yes, seriously. We take ourselves seriously, but not very." Their refusal to be defensive or pompous disarmed critics who expected them to be arrogant. In press conferences, they turned questions back on their interrogators. When asked if they'd get haircuts, George replied, quote, "When asked what they thought of American Girls, Ringo said, they were charming, quick, impossible to pin down." This media savvy was part of their appeal. They navigated the press better than most politicians. They never seemed rehearsed or managed, even though Brian Epstein had carefully prepared them. They came across as authentic, genuine, 4 regular guys who happened to be famous. Behind the scenes, though, the pressure was building. The screaming that seemed exciting at first became oppressive. The Beatles couldn't hear themselves perform. Concert venues became increasingly chaotic and dangerous. At one show, a girl broke through security and made it onto the stage, wrapping herself around Paul's legs. At another, fans broke through police barricades and rushed the stage en masse. The Beatles were prisoners of their fame. They couldn't go anywhere without being mobbed. Room service was the only way they could eat. Hotel rooms became cells. The view from the tour bus was of crowds of screaming fans outside every venue. John Lennon would later describe this period as the time they became the world's most famous prisoners. The irony wasn't lost on them. They'd achieved everything they'd dreamed of, but the price was higher than they'd imagined. Still, in early '64, the excitement outweighed the challenges. They were young, successful beyond their wildest dreams, and changing the world. The future stretched before them, full of possibilities. The resistance they faced from adult critics and authorities only confirmed that they were doing something important, something that threatened the status quo. If the establishment hated them, they must be doing something right. The battle lines were drawn. On one side, the forces of conformity, tradition, authority. On the other, the forces of change, youth, creativity. The Beatles hadn't asked to be symbols of generational conflict, but that's what they became. And in living rooms across America, teenagers watched the controversy and made their choice. They chose the Beatles. They chose change. They chose the future. February 9th, '64, was when the choice became clear. By the end of 1964, popular culture in America had been fundamentally transformed. The Beatles had appeared on Ed Sullivan in February. By December, they'd released 2 more albums in America, starred in a film, completed a North American tour, and dominated the charts for most of the year. But their impact went far beyond their own commercial success. They'd changed what was possible in popular music. Before the Beatles, the idea that a rock and roll group would write their own songs was unusual. Most acts recorded songs written by professional songwriters, produced by professionals, with studio musicians providing the backing. The singer was just a voice, a personality, a product. The Beatles demonstrated that musicians could be artists in the fullest sense. They wrote, they performed, they influenced their production. They had creative control, or at least fought for it. They weren't puppets on strings. This opened the floodgates. Suddenly, every band wanted to write original material. Record labels started looking for self-contained groups instead of just singers. The singer-songwriter model that would dominate the late '60s was made possible by the Beatles' example. The album, as an artistic statement, also evolved from their influence. Before the Beatles, albums were mostly collections of singles padded with filler tracks. The Beatles started treating albums as cohesive artistic statements. This would culminate in '67 with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. But the seeds were planted in '64. The relationship between musicians and their audience changed too. The Beatles spoke directly to their fans through their music and their public personas. They weren't distant manufactured stars. They were relatable, human, accessible. This directness, this authenticity, even if it was partially manufactured by Brian Epstein, became the template for rock stardom. They also changed the demographics of the music industry. Before the Beatles, the music business catered to adults. Parents bought records for their kids, or kids bought what their parents approved of. The Beatles created a market of teenagers buying music for themselves, music their parents didn't understand or like. This teenage market had enormous purchasing power. The music industry reorganized itself to serve it. Radio formats evolved. Billboard charts proliferated. Marketing targeted youth directly. The industry that exists today, where youth tastes drive popular music, was born in the Beatles' wake. Fashion and visual style became integral to music in new ways. The Beatles understood that in the television age, how you looked mattered as much as how you sounded. Their visual style, the matching suits, the haircuts, the way they moved on stage, was as carefully considered as their music. This led to the emergence of music video culture, though it wouldn't be called that for another 20 years. The Beatles pioneered the concept with promotional films for their songs, understanding that visual representation could enhance music's impact. Youth culture as a distinct entity, separate from and sometimes opposed to adult culture, crystallized around the Beatles. Before them, teenagers were expected to age into adult tastes. After the Beatles, youth culture became self-sustaining, with its own values, aesthetics, and industries catering to it. The British invasion the Beatles led also changed America's relationship with the rest of the world. American popular culture had been exported globally for decades. Now, for the first time since World War II, cultural influence was flowing the other way. Britain, still recovering economically from the war, was conquering America culturally. This had political implications. It signaled that American cultural dominance wasn't absolute, that creativity and innovation could come from anywhere. It opened American audiences to international influences in ways they hadn't been before. The Beatles' success also inspired other art forms. The energy and creativity of their music influenced film, literature, visual art. The 60s explosion of creativity across all artistic mediums owes something to the Beatles' demonstration that popular art could be ambitious and innovative. Film changed. A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles' first film, revolutionized music movies and influenced the French New Wave aesthetic that was percolating through cinema. The jump cuts, the handheld cameras, the breaking of traditional narrative structure, all influenced by the Beatles' energy and irreverence. Television evolved. Variety shows like Ed Sullivan's would soon seem old-fashioned. The Beatles pointed toward a new kind of entertainment that was faster, looser, more youth-oriented. The Monkees television show, launched in '66, was directly inspired by the Beatles' film. Even advertising changed. The youth market was too valuable to ignore. Commercials started using rock music, targeting teenagers, adopting the visual language of youth culture. The '60s advertising revolution, where creativity and rebellion were used to sell products, followed in the Beatles' wake. Looking back, it's remarkable how much changed in such a short time. February '64. America's popular culture looked one way. By December '64, it looked entirely different. The transformation was swift, decisive, and irreversible. The Ed Sullivan appearance was the catalyst, the moment when the transformation became visible to everyone. 73 million people witnessed the future arriving in real time. And here's what's truly remarkable. The Beatles were just getting started. In '64, they were still primarily a pop group singing love songs. The experimental, psychedelic, deeply influential later Beatles were yet to come. Even at this early stage, even when they were still relatively simple, they changed everything. What they'd do next would be even more revolutionary. But it all started on that Sunday night in February when America sat down to watch Ed Sullivan and saw the future walk onto the stage. 60 years have passed since that February night. 6 decades of culture, technology, and change. And yet, the Beatles' influence echoes still. Every major artist of the past 60 years exists in the Beatles' shadow. Ask any musician who their influences are, and eventually you'll hear the Beatles mentioned. Even artists who sound nothing like them, even in genres that didn't exist in '64, acknowledge the Beatles' impact. Rock music as we know it was shaped by their example. The idea of the self-contained band, writing, performing, recording together, became the standard model. Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, The Who, all the great bands of the late '60s and '70s followed the template the Beatles established. The singer-songwriter movement of the '70s, James Taylor, Carole King, Joni Mitchell, built on the foundation the Beatles laid, showing that personal, introspective songwriting could be commercially successful. Punk rock in the late '70s was partly a reaction against the elaborate production the Beatles had pioneered. But even in rebelling against them, punk acknowledged their influence. The DIY ethos of punk, quote 49, came from the Beatles' demonstration that regular kids could make extraordinary music. Alternative rock in the '80s and '90s, grunge in the early '90s, indie rock in the 2000s, All traced their lineage back, directly or indirectly, to the Beatles. The idea that music could be both popular and artistically ambitious started with them. Even hip-hop, a genre that emerged long after the Beatles' breakup, has been influenced by them. Sampling Beatles records, referencing their cultural impact, studying their business acumen, hip-hop artists recognize the Beatles as pioneers of artist autonomy and creative control. Pop stars like Madonna, Michael Jackson, Prince, all learned from the Beatles' understanding that visual presentation and persona matter as much as music. The Beatles invented modern celebrity as much as they invented modern rock. The business of music changed because of them. The Beatles fought for artistic control, for ownership of their music, for creative freedom. They didn't always win those fights. They famously lost control of their early catalog, but they established that artists should fight for those things. Their influence extends beyond music. The cultural revolution of the 60s, which reshaped American society, was partly soundtracked and inspired by the Beatles. The questioning of authority, the emphasis on peace and love, the exploration of consciousness, all were amplified by their music and example. Fashion still references them. Mod style comes back periodically. Those slim suits, those boots, that hair. Designers mine the Beatles' look for inspiration. Runway shows feature Beatles-inspired collections. The aesthetic they popularized remains influential. The very concept of fandom, of fan culture, was shaped by Beatlemania. The intensity of devotion, the collecting of memorabilia, the analysis of every detail. Modern fan culture has its roots in how Beatles fans behaved. Comic-Con, online fan communities, all of it descends from the screaming girls at Ed Sullivan. Tourism in Liverpool exists largely because of the Beatles. Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane, the Cavern Club. These are pilgrimage sites for fans worldwide. The Beatles' childhood homes are preserved as museums. Their economic impact on their hometown is still substantial 60 years later. In education, the Beatles are studied in music classes, history classes, sociology courses. They're analyzed in academic papers and PhD dissertations. They've become part of the canon, worthy of serious scholarly attention. The Abbey Road crossing is one of the most photographed locations in London, recreating the album cover photo, a ritual for tourists. The crosswalk has to be repainted frequently because of all the foot traffic. Security cameras are aimed at it so people around the world can watch live streams of people recreating the photo. Museums dedicated to the Beatles exist around the world. In Liverpool, in London, in Hamburg, in Los Angeles. Their instruments, their clothing, their handwritten lyrics are preserved and displayed as cultural artifacts. The surviving members, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, remain relevant and active 60 years later. Paul still tours, still writes new music, still plays to packed stadiums. When he performs Hey Jude or Let It Be, audiences spanning multiple generations sing along. 3 generations of fans, from those who saw them on Ed Sullivan to their great-grandchildren, know the words. Cover versions of Beatles songs number in the thousands. Every genre, every style, every language has Beatles covers. From jazz to bluegrass, from punk to symphonic, musicians can't resist interpreting Beatles songs. Yesterday is the most covered song in popular music history. The cultural moments they created remain reference points. Everyone knows what Beatlemania means. The Ed Sullivan appearance is taught in history classes as a pivotal cultural moment. The British invasion is historical terminology. These are permanent parts of our cultural vocabulary. Economically, the Beatles' catalog continues to generate enormous revenue. Their music streams billions of times. Each new generation discovers them. Remastered editions, deluxe box sets, archival releases. The catalog is endlessly recyclable because the music remains relevant. In 2016, when the Beatles catalog finally came to streaming services, it was a major cultural event. The delay had made their music seem special, important, worth waiting for. When it finally arrived, Beatles songs immediately dominated streaming charts. The influence on technology and media is harder to quantify, but equally real. The Beatles pioneered music videos, elaborate album artwork, concept albums, all of which shaped how music is packaged and presented. Their breakup in 1970 was such a cultural earthquake that the aftershocks are still felt. The idea that a band at its peak could choose to end on their terms rather than fade away influenced countless artists' decisions about when and how to end their careers. The mythology around them has only grown. Books, documentaries, films about the Beatles number in the hundreds. Peter Jackson's Get Back documentary in 2021 introduced them to yet another generation. The fascination never ends. And it all traces back to that night, February 9th, 1964. 73 million Americans watching. 4 young men from Liverpool, nervous and excited, stepping onto a stage in New York. 12 minutes that changed the world. The echoes of those 12 minutes still reverberate through our culture 60 years later. And they'll continue for as long as people care about music, about culture, about the power of art to transform society. Let's return to where we started. February 9th, 1964. Studio 50 in New York City. Ed Sullivan introducing the Beatles to America. If you were watching that night, you witnessed one of those rare moments when the world pivots, when culture shifts, when history happens in real time. Most historical moments are only recognized as important in retrospect. But that night, even in the moment, people sensed they were witnessing something extraordinary. Think about what those 73 million people saw. On the surface, just 4 young men playing music. Simple songs about love and holding hands. Nothing overtly revolutionary. Nothing that seemed likely to change the world. But in those 12 minutes, they saw something else too, even if they couldn't articulate it. They saw autonomy. 4 musicians who controlled their own music. They saw joy, genuine pleasure in performing. They saw a possibility, that you could be successful on your own terms. They saw the future, that youth culture could create its own values and aesthetics. The girls screaming in that studio audience weren't just excited about music. They were expressing something deeper. Freedom, desire, the right to have strong feelings and express them loudly. In 1964, when girls were still expected to be quiet and proper, that screaming was revolutionary. The boys watching at home weren't just admiring musicians. They were seeing a model of masculinity different from their father's generation. The Beatles weren't stoic and emotionally distant. They were expressive, creative, collaborative. They showed that men could make art, could work together, could be vulnerable and strong simultaneously. Parents watching with a mixture of confusion and concern weren't just seeing a music act they didn't understand. They were seeing the first wave of a generational shift that would reshape America. Their children were choosing different values, different aesthetics, different paths. The authority they'd taken for granted was being questioned. All of this from 12 minutes of performance. All of this from 4 guys singing about wanting to hold your hand. The genius of the Beatles was that they made revolution seem fun. They weren't angry or confrontational. They were joyful, charming, witty. They invited everyone to join them in something exciting, and millions accepted that invitation. The Ed Sullivan appearance was the invitation going out to 73 million people at once. The Beatles seemed to say, and America's youth responded with an enthusiastic yes. What followed, the British invasion, the countercultural revolution, The transformation of rock into an art form, all of it, flowed from that moment. The boulders started rolling that night, and it's never stopped. For those of you who were watching that night, you already know this. You remember where you were, who you were with, how you felt. It's etched in your memory alongside other defining moments of your life. The Beatles on Ed Sullivan, Kennedy's assassination, the moon landing, the day you got married, the births of your children. These moments stay with you. For those who came later, who know the Beatles only through recordings and documentaries, it might be hard to understand the magnitude of what happened. In an era of fragmented media, when we all watch different things at different times, the idea of 73 million people experiencing the same moment simultaneously seems almost impossible. But that's what happened. For one night, America was united in watching something together, and what they saw changed them, changed culture, changed history. The beautiful thing is that the music survives. You can still listen to those performances from the Ed Sullivan shows. You can watch the footage and see the joy, the energy, the magic that captivated millions. The music hasn't aged. Oh, the recording technology sounds dated. The video quality is primitive by modern standards. But the songs themselves remain vital and alive. She Loves You still makes you want to shake your head and sing along. I Want to Hold Your Hand still captures the excitement of young love. All My Loving still charms with its earnest romanticism. The music works because it's genuine, because it comes from a real place, because it speaks to universal human emotions. That's why new generations keep discovering the Beatles. Every few years, another wave of young people finds their music and falls in love with it. The Beatles transcend their time, because underneath the 60s surface, they're singing about things that never go out of style: love, joy, longing, hope. The cultural moment of Beatlemania can't be recreated. That specific time, that specific context, that specific impact, it was unique to 1964. But the music lives on, independent of that moment, powerful in its own right. February 9th, 1964, changed the world. But it also gave the world something that would endure long after the screaming stopped, long after the hysteria faded, long after the cultural revolution moved on. It gave us the music. Simple, joyful, human music that reminds us what it feels like to be young, to be in love, to be alive and full of possibility. 73 million people tuned in that night expecting entertainment. What they got was transformation. What they witnessed was history. What they received was a gift that keeps giving, 60 years later and counting. The Beatles took the stage on Ed Sullivan and showed America what joy looked like, what creativity could accomplish, what four guys with guitars could do if they believed in themselves and each other. The night the Beatles changed everything was also the night everything became possible. That stage, that performance, that moment, it never really ended. It's still echoing, still influencing, still inspiring, still reminding us that culture can transform, that music matters, that 12 minutes can change the world. If you were there, you know. If you weren't, now you understand. February 9th, 1964. The night the Beatles changed everything. And we're still living in the world they helped create.